Okay, when we left off last time, we were talking about the spread of Westphalian ideas to other parts of the world through colonization, imperialism, wars, economic activities, and so on and so forth. There are many examples that you could use to explain how this happened, but I want to focus on the Philippines because the Philippines is my area of expertise, or it was my area of expertise as a graduate student, and I think it provides a great case study in just how Westphalian ideas were spread and how they were adopted in areas where Westphalian ideas did not exist previously. So let's get in a time machine and let's go back to the pre-Spanish Philippines, the Philippines prior to the arrival of the Spanish in 1521. What would you find? Well, it's probably better to think about what you would not find. First and foremost, prior to the Spanish arrival in the Philippines, there was no idea of a nation state. Had you gone from the islands of Mindanao to the Visayas to the Luzon region and you asked people there, what country do you belong to, they would have not been able to answer. First, they would not have understood this word country. What do you mean by this? They would not have had some sort of common identity where the people from the north, south, east, and west would have felt some sort of kinship. There was no idea of a nation state. There was no national flag. There was no national army. There was no national anthem. It simply did not exist. There was no common cultural identity. Even in the Philippines, we think of them as being Filipinos today, but at the time, they were a diverse mix of tribal cultures, and they had no affinity or affection for each other. They often spoke different languages. They were divided along tribal lines, so you'd find tribal factions in hundreds of languages spoken, even on the same island, in many cases. In terms of organized religion, most of the Filipinos at the time were animists. They followed the various gods of nature, although in some parts of the Philippines, Islam had made the jump over from Brunei, on the island of Borneo, and parts of Indonesia into the Philippines, and there was some conversion there. But there were no great temples, there were no great churches, there were no large mosques of any kind in the Philippines prior to the arrival of the Spanish, for the most part. And so the islands were a diverse mix of tribal groups speaking different languages with no idea of common nationality in the way we think of it today. There was also very little trade in the Philippines with outside powers. There were very little inroads made from other civilizations. You just take a quick boat ride over into Indonesia and you will find great works of art and temple structure from the Buddhist and Hindu kingdoms. And even when the Indonesian islands converted slowly to Islam, the great mosques and other cities that were built there prior to the arrival of the Dutch, well, none of that exists in the Philippines. So you had little trade. A lot of it was pre-modern. A lot of it was an Iron Age existence, and you had very little in terms of cultural input from neighboring civilizations. In many ways, the Philippines is a perfect example of what can happen to a tabula rasa, to a blank slate, when the colonies, the colonial powers, come to the Philippines and take it over. This is not to say that the people didn't have culture, but it wasn't the kind that was organized in the way that European society had organized their society, or even in the way the Chinese had organized, or in mainland Southeast Asia for that matter. So the Philippines was a perfect test ground for what was to come in terms of the ideas of Westphalia. So we look at Westphalian ideas being spread in the Philippines. Well, first and foremost, when the Spanish arrived in 1521 and laid claim to the islands, and they would return several years later and start colonizing the place, they brought with them civil organization to the scattered tribes, and primarily this civil organization was done by the Catholic Church. Oftentimes more priests than soldiers would come with the Spanish and help organize and rule over the Filipinos in the Philippines. So they baptized most of the population. They changed their names. This is how we get the Spanish names in the Philippines. They took a census, recorded the population. They brought the people out of the jungles, organized them into cities. They built infrastructures, roads, bridges, churches, schools, and they began to turn the Philippines into a colony. So in less than 200 years, the Philippines goes from a Neolithic tribal existence for the most part to a fully functioning Spanish colony in less than 200 years. And a lot of this is because of the activities of the Catholic Church, still a very powerful force in the Philippines. So after becoming a colony, education and Western ideas flood into the island simply because of being part of the Spanish Empire. You know, you had a lot of Spanish coming there, civil servants, their children. They would marry local women. Their children would be the mestizos, the mixed race. They would often go to Spain and study. So a lot of the ideas of Europe were transmitted through the Spanish to the Philippines, including ideas found in the Westphalian treaties. The Filipinos themselves, during this time, began to see themselves as part of a larger world. They began to see themselves as part of a larger identity. Filipinos quickly learned that they were not the same as the Indonesians next to them, or the Malaysians in the English colony of Malaya, or the Thais, or the Khmers, or the Nam Viets, or whomever we're talking about, the Chinese. They were in fact something different. And their tribal differences were minor in comparison to the differences outside of the islands. And their language differences were minor compared to the differences of languages outside of the islands. And so over time, with the help of the Spanish authorities, they began to see themselves as something different, as something other than simply a part of a tribe. They began to adapt and adopt this common identity from north, south, east, and west as being part of this country called the Philippines, part of this nation state. Not quite a nation state yet, but it was moving in that direction. And again, a lot of this is in response to what the church is doing in the Philippines. And this ultimately leads to a struggle for independence in 1898. The Philippines actually becomes the first Southeast Asian country to want to have independence from its colonial master. And so in 1898, it launches a war of independence, and you probably know the history. The United States gets involved. We have our own conflict with Spain at the time. And we approach the soldiers in the Philippines, with Filipino soldiers, and we tell them, we will help you in your war with Spain, and once the Spanish are defeated, we will leave, and you will come and become an independent country. Well, things didn't quite work out that way. We did help the Filipinos in their war against Spain. The Spanish were defeated, and the Filipinos thanked us. They appreciated our help, and then they asked us to leave. And then the United States said, well, you know what, we're not going to leave just yet. We're not going to leave just yet. You're not quite ready for independence yet. So we reneged on our promise. We kind of stabbed them in the back, let's be honest. And so the United States would take over the Philippines in 1898. We would have to launch a war against Filipinos, and it would last until 1902, until they were finally defeated. And we took over the islands for the next 50 years. Now, all was not negative, of course. The war was negative. Many people lost their lives in the pacification of the Philippines. And in fact, this was our first war in Southeast Asia. But as part of America's colonial empire, we continued westernizing the islands of the Philippines. We continued building infrastructure. We continued teaching language. We continued to educate Filipinos in the United States and giving them the opportunity to travel around the world. And the ideas of Westphalia grew even stronger. And so by 1945, at the end of the Second World War, the Philippines became the first Southeast Asian nation to win its independence from a colonial power, that power being the United States of America. And so you see, if we were to draw this out graphically, the Philippines represents the perfect example of a tribal identity. A land that had no clear national borders, just islands scattered around, no clear national language, everyone speaking a different language, tribal identities, moving from that to a colony of a Western power, in this case Spain and later the United States. As part of that colony, it became westernized. It not only adopted our language and our method of education, but it adopted our values and even our religion. And so identity, concepts of nationalism merged with what was already there in the Philippines, and they were westernized, and they were very capable of adopting the Westphalian values by the time the colonial period was over. And this led to independence. Of course, looking at Westphalia, you see the ideas of sovereignty, and you see the ideas of equality, and you want this for yourself. You read the documents like the U.S. Constitution, and you read the documents coming out of the Enlightenment, and you want this for yourself. And the Filipinos read these things, and they wanted them for themselves. And ultimately, their struggle to gain that independence, to gain that sovereignty, succeeded. And in 1945, they became a full member of the family of nation states, fully sovereign, fully independent, full territorial integrity, full equality, and a full member of the United Nations. From a tribal society to a member of the United Nations. This is a typical process that we see throughout the colonial world happening in Africa, Southeast Asia, South America, where these colonies adopt over time Westphalian values. So Western ideas built the idea of nation states in the world, like the Philippines, and made them what we are today. Now, the next slide here, I have construction of national identity. This goes into what Westphalia was able to achieve. You see there, prior to Westphalia, loyalty was usually at the tribe, or loyalty was usually at the city, or loyalty was at the sub-state level. But after the colonial period, with the Westphalian values pouring into these colonies, national identity emerged in much of the world. And we talked about in the case of the Philippines just how this happened. But I also like to talk of another case, the case of India. Now, we know India, unlike the Philippines, had a very long and glorious history. How far back do you want to go? 2,000 years? 5,000 years? We're still uncovering the glory that is ancient India, the ancient cities and the empires and the great religions coming out of India, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, just among a few. So they were not a tabula rasa. They were not the kind of blank slate, if you will, that maybe some other countries represented. They were, in fact, a vibrant people. Nonetheless, they were colonized. They were colonized by the French and by the British. Ultimately, the British would take over, and the Portuguese, but the British would take over. And they would play a role in helping sew India together. Because by the time the British came, India was fragmented into hundreds of petty kingdoms, some Hindu, some Muslim, some something else. But the British tied all of these petty kingdoms together. The British gave them the idea that they were something other than what the outsiders were. They gave them this identity of India, of Hindustan, of being something other than what they were before. And to their credit, the Indians adopted this sort of thing. Now, prior to the British, it was difficult. If you could take a time machine back 500 years ago, prior to the arrival and the control of the British, and you were to ask someone in India, hey, are you an Indian? He would have said, I'm a what? What's an Indian? What's India? These words were unknown. If you would have asked them, are you a Hindu? He would say, a Hindu? What's that? Even the idea of being Hindu was unknown. These ideas came with the British. Take the idea of being a Hindu. What is a Hindu? What is a Hindu? Well, the British use this word Hindu very specifically. If you were not Christian, if you were not a Muslim, if you were not a follower of the Buddha, you were a Hindu. Now, of course, we know if you study Hinduism, Hinduism is a very diverse religion. But the term Hindu is sort of like a catch-all term. Followers of Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, Ganesh, Kali, whomever, can all be considered Hindus, although their religious practices may be very different. Even the religions, the texts may be very different. But yet we consider them Hindus. Why? Because the British classified them this way. The British also built railroads, and railroads connected north, south, east, and west of India together. People began to travel, and they began to realize, hey, we have things in common. And what else? The British gave them English. English allowed Indians from all over the country to communicate with each other in ways they never could before. Prior to the arrival of the British, you were Tamil, or you were Gujarati, or you were from Uttar Pradesh, or you were from Rajasthan, and you couldn't really understand each other. Their languages were vastly different. But now you had the medium of English. Now you could communicate. Now you could travel over rail. Now you could realize you belong to something special. You belong to India. And so an identity begins to form. So much so that in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, the Indian National Congress was formed, and people, great leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and others, rise up and they demand independence for their country, India, an idea that never really existed prior to the modern world. But now it existed. Now they had commonality. Now they had common language. Now they had a common flag. Now they had everything in common, and now they wanted the outsiders to go, and they had wanted to adopt the Westphalian values for themselves: sovereignty, territorial integrity, equality, and become a fully functioning member of the family of nation states. And we know, of course, that India succeeded. They gained their independence. It fractured into Pakistan and Bangladesh. 3 countries came out of this process, but nonetheless, 3 sovereign, 3 independent, 3 equal countries, all embracing the Westphalian system. Prior to the arrival of the West, Indians had no idea about Westphalia or any of the ideas of the Westphalian system. After the colonial period, not only did they have an idea, but they were fully functioning members of that system. And we can see the same thing happening around the world. In Africa, in China, in Japan, in the Philippines. It is a remarkable story. I wish I had more time to discuss it with you. But let's stop right here, right now. I'm going to keep these lectures short and digestible. If you have any questions regarding the construction of national identity or the Westphalian system and how it spread, please feel free to contact me at your convenience. Up next is a discussion you might enjoy. We're going to talk about how the construction of national identity takes place, and we're going to look at the tools of nationalism. And students always love to talk about the tools of nationalism, and I hope that in our discussion, maybe we'll get to ask a question or two about the tools of nationalism as well. They're fun to talk about. All right, until then, this is Dr. S saying good luck.